Uh-oh, we're live.
Yeah.
Yay, we did it.
Yeah.
Sorry, everyone. We're a little late, but it's all good. It's all good, right? So good afternoon, everyone. We'll give everyone a couple of minutes to join the live session sponsored by Animal Farm Foundation and ACO Insurance Consulting. Um, we're about to have a great discussion. So just give everyone a minute here.
I'm feeling pumped,
I
even
know,
though we're going to
right?
talk about something real miserable.
Well, we're trying to make it better, right? We're trying. We're trying. So, but it'll be all good. All good. How's your Tuesday going so far? Pretty good?
Pretty chill. It's still really sunny out, and I can't wait to go outside right after this.
Yes, 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 yes. The sun is out. The sun is out. All right. You ready to get started?
For sure.
Let's go. Let's go. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon once again. My name is Ngozi Nnaji, and I am the founder of ACO Insurance Consulting, a consulting firm focused on diversifying the future of the insurance industry. And we are a strong partner, a longtime partner of the Animal Farm Foundation in their fight against breed restrictions, dog breed restrictions in the area of zoning, housing, and insurance. And with me, I have a special guest, not a new guest, but still a special
Exactly.
guest.
We're back at it.
Yo, okay, Kassidi Jones, PhD student from Yale University, racial justice advocate, and most importantly, a dog mom, right?
That's
That should be at
me.
the top, right?
You're right. It's the first thing I tell people about myself.
Most important. Great, great. Well, hey, girl, hey.
Good to see you again. Always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure, right? Because we have so much fun in our conversation. So it's such a joy to be with you again. And, maybe we should level set for our audience because, again, this
Okay.
is our second kind of live session. And so we want to kind of take the audience back to when we first met, right? When we first had
Mhm.
time together, we talked about all the things.
So many
From,
things.
I mean, I know, can you remember, right?
Mhm.
But so many things, anywhere from we started off with this conversation around what I call Black community dog relations, right?
Mhm.
And how white supremacy in the United States and America has impacted that,
Mhm.
not for the better, for the worse. We took that conversation from there to kind of the kind of the premise of Animal Farm and their advocacy work around breed restrictions and how that has impacted communities of color all over the US, right? In
Mhm.
various different areas. It's not specific to one state or one city, but multiple cities and multiple areas. And then also kind of left with a call of action, right?
Mhm.
Dog lovers, community lovers, what can you do in this fight against breed restriction? Because it does and it will impact you. And
Absolutely.
so we got a great response. I mean, I was so thrilled. We got a great response not only from the Black community, from the dog loving community, for also even the racial justice community, right? Like everybody wanted to continue this conversation. So you and I, we put our heads together. We were like, yo, we could do this.
We could
we,
do
could,
this.
we could do this.
Yeah.
So I think part of, this continuing of the conversation is let's get deeper, right? Let's give the people what they
Yeah.
and really explore with them one, what does it mean or what has the story been or what's the history behind what I call Black community dog relations. And so we're going to take
Mhm.
y'all back. We're going to take y'all back and hope
Way back.
you continue on this journey with us because I'm stuck with this sister girl here for 3 series. A 3-part series. So we're gonna get real
Surely.
close. We're gonna get to know
Yup.
each other.
Mhm.
Hopefully we can create some education and awareness for you around the relationship that Black people have had in the United States, starting with slavery,
Mhm.
taking that conversation from slavery to kind of the civil rights movement, right? And how there was impact there. but then bring it all the way to the current day, present tense, and what we're dealing with from breed restrictions and legislation in that context. So again, we're about to get a little deep. We're about to get a little granular. So go ahead, take out your notepads, your
Hmm.
pens, right, your recorders, whatever it takes. You need this information. It's going to be good. It's going to be good. Anything you want to
Agreed.
add, Cassidy, before we start?
I'm just really hoping that people watch this one, of course, but stay for the whole series so you can see how all of these issues are interconnected and how things from the period of enslavement are still popping up in our relationships today. So stay tuned. I think it's going to be
Yes.
a good chat.
Or we'll come and find you. No, just kidding.
Right.
Right. That
Don't no
part.
show for
Right.
series part 2 because we looking.
We look at. Look, she's an academic. I'm an academic. Look, there's going to be a quiz, a test, right? There's
Right,
going to be
right.
a whole thing behind this. But let's get started. Let's start this conversation with a tough topic,
Hmm.
right? Slavery is not necessarily the thing that you sit around the dinner table talking about. It's still a very hard topic for people to discuss, to have conversation around. And then when you add this to that conversation around slavery, enslavement, you know, the conversation around pet lovers and dogs, right? Like the fact that we love our pets, it becomes even more of a hard conversation. And so,
Hmm.
our beloved friends, we love them, but historically, when we look at the relationship between Black people, slaves, right, during that time, and dogs, and we start to have this conversation again around that relationship in America, we have to talk about how dogs were used as a part of the whole slave trade movement and the
Hmm.
whole era from that context. And it has been documented, and you shared with me papers, articles, and we've had this discussion that, you know, in the 1800s, there existed this title around Negro dogs.
Hmm.
So now that concept or that title was new to me. I never heard of it before, especially when looking in the articles and doing the research.
Mm.
Um, can you explain what that term means? Where did it come from? How does it relate to kind of slavery, and why is it relevant?
Yeah, Negro dogs or Negro hounds or N-word hounds, you're going to see a lot of different terminology coming up for them when you look at primary sources from the 19th century, especially 18th, 19th century, especially. Um, but it refers to a dog who's trained specifically to hunt Black people, track Black people, especially those who escaped bondage. Um, so white enslavers wanted to reclaim their property who had run away, and used dogs as a tool to go reclaim what belonged to them because Black people aren't seen as people at the time. So um, it makes sense that we were treated like game, essentially.
Mm,
Uh, So these dogs are descended from dogs in like Cuban bloodhounds. There's like a Brazilian bloodhound, but they were bred once they got to the U.S. South to do the dirty work of enslavement.
so you said bred,
Yes,
meaning like trained to actually, that was their purpose, right? To
right,
capture slaves.
right. They
You know,
were. Mhm. Keep going.
no, I guess to think about that, right? It's kind of like, wow,
It's pretty shocking,
it is.
and in some ways, not shocking at all. We've
Mm,
seen dogs being used as tools for white supremacy all along. So it's no
true,
surprise that they learned
true,
this very
true.
early. Um, so yeah, they would breed dogs that are more aggressive, obviously, toward Black people because we couldn't have dogs going around attacking everybody. We got to
Right.
keep white people safe. So we need to show these dogs specifically to treat Black people as less than, to treat them like food. There are cases documented of Black flesh being fed to dogs in order
Mm.
to try to stir up that Black bloodthirst. There are examples of enslaved people being forced to beat dogs very cruelly and viciously and then run so that the dog learned that Black people are threats. to be neutralized and hunted and chased and
Mhm.
feared and all of that.
Mhm.
Um, it was a whole system of pitting black folks and dogs against each other for the purpose of white supremacy.
So again, like I obviously, I mean, there's a certain awareness, right, as a black woman, as you know, a descendant from you know slaves or whatnot, that there's an you know you're aware of kind of the violence, right, that existed during that time, and so again, to think of the fact that dogs were used as kind of weapons, right, in
Mm-hmm.
which to attack, to you know retrieve, in your words, slaves, is kind of like, wow, I mean, this is not a game, y'all. This is not a game, right? And I
Mm-mm.
joke, but it was very serious. And so, you know, what I'm trying to wrap my head around, and I'm sure others in the audience, is that, you know, we have individuals, right? Slave owners and the like, who actually had the authority, right, to really use these, again, weapons. Unfortunately, there were
Mm-hmm.
their dogs, and given this, again, the full authority to essentially maintain this level of black subordination in order to continue white domination.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, based on what you're saying, it sounds like these dogs were not just used as ways to keep slaves in line, but really to keep this southern culture in place,
Absolutely.
right? Like this was part of the society, and this is part of what was the norm
Mm-hmm.
at that time and in that area. So, can you speak more about kind of the normancy of, you know, Negro dogs
Mm-hmm.
and slave patrols and slave catchers? Like how normal was that?
Yeah, it's not uncommon to go back to a newspaper from this time and see an advertisement someone has placed because they have the finest Negro dogs in the area, dogs that have never missed their target, meaning that they always catch Black people, they always retrieve the property that they are sent to retrieve. They brag about how accurate and how vicious their dogs can be.
Mhm,
Um, and it'll be next to an ad for, it'll be next to an article about the crops or
mhm,
anything, just very normal part of the day to day. And we know that there are a lot of fugitive slave wanted ads in papers already. People see those, but there's also a whole market for people who want to lease out their dogs for the purpose
mhm.
of hunting these Black people.
So you're right, Brittany. I mean, that's the whole point, right? Like the dogs didn't wake up one day and say, "Hey, I want to be a Negro dog," right?
Right.
They were definitely trained, right, to
Mm-hmm.
what Brittany, I mean, to what Cassidy is talking about, and they were kind of taught to act this way, respond this way, attack this way, and be used as weapons. And so,
Mm-hmm.
again, I want to, you know, I want to reiterate that because I think in our further discussion, series two, series three, we'll go into more conversation around, you know, wasn't our plan, right?
Right.
We didn't set this up
Mm-hmm.
around this kind of negative perception around relationships between Black people and dogs.
Mm-hmm.
This was a strategy used by white supremacists, by, you know, to, again, to maintain the domination that they had versus the subordination of Black people at that time, and even now, right? But we'll talk about that in
Mm-hmm.
series
We'll talk
three.
about, come to part two, part three.
Right, we're going to continue that
Yeah.
conversation.
And it's
So
also, oh, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
It's also important for me to say that dogs are being used as the tools here. Dogs are an extension of the arm of white supremacy, not because they themselves are white supremacists, but because
Mhm,
they are being forced into complicity for something they probably would not want to do. I can't
mhm.
see a dog naturally wanting to just hunt a specific kind of person. So this is being forced into them as well. And when I mentioned the story about how enslaved people were forced to beat dogs, like everyone's losing except for white
Mhm,
people.
mhm. No, good point. Good point to be made. Now, again, you know, the conversation we're having is around, again, the utilization of dogs to retrieve, to attack, right? We were property. How do you get your property back as a slave owner? But the irony, I think, also during this time, and again, going back to the research, the studies, the articles, is that not only were dogs used as weapons, but we as Black people, as slaves, couldn't own dogs either.
Mm-hmm.
So help me understand why that was. You know, we were they're used against us, but
Mhm.
in the same, I guess, sentence conversation, we couldn't even own them.
Right. There's a lot of legislation put forward and proposed, rarely actually codified because of the logistics, but serious and sustained efforts to keep Black people both free and enslaved from having dogs, um, mostly because white supremacy is afraid of itself. uh, they were worried about the violence they were enacting being enacted upon them, so they didn't want Black people to have these weapons in the same way that a lot of slaveholding people would forbid the people they enslaved to have a gun for
Mhm.
obvious reasons. They would do the same thing with dogs to try to protect themselves.
So in with that, you know, again, going back to what I read, like it was almost as if this decision around not having slaves own dogs was to keep them in the context of being property, right? Like
Absolutely.
how does property own property, right?
Right.
That's not a thing, right? So, you know, if you're property yourself, then how dare you own your own property? And I
Mm-hmm.
think what what it reminds me of is this attempt to dehumanize us, right? And
Mm-hmm.
make us really commodity cargo, whatever, you know, however you want it in the context of slavery. Obviously, we serve different purposes, but like to keep us from being seen as human,
Mm-hmm.
as some level of being equal. And so if you want to maintain that, right, you take away kind of our rights and ability to be seen as such. And I found that very interesting. I just found that very interesting. Um,
Yeah, it's gross. It's like you
yeah,
read these
let's be
petitions from
honest.
all across the 19th century, like starting in the single digits. The first one I remember seeing was from South Carolina in 1807, all the
Mhm.
way through the 1870s, where people are saying that Black owned dogs specifically are a threat, particularly to livestock, because dogs were out here killing sheep for sure. It was not just the dogs that belonged to Black people.
Right.
However, the people that kind of championed these movements knew they wouldn't get as much support if they tried to regulate white people's rights. They couldn't get a lot of support for saying nobody should have dogs, but they could definitely get a lot of backing for saying Black people can't do something. So that was a political strategy, basically, to say that dogs in Black hands are more reckless and more violent and more of a threat.
Hmm. That sounds so familiar, does it?
And don't it? Come to part two.
All right, we're gonna break that down in part two, right? Because ultimately, I mean, what you're saying, Cassidy, is that the legislation around ownership for Black people, or the prevention of ownership for Black people of dogs, is really kind of the foundational work to what we see today around breed restrictions, right? Like, I mean,
Mhm.
can we draw that line? Can we draw that correlation?
Absolutely. It's all about who can have a dog and where and why. It's the same questions that are being asked in the 19th century as today about who's a threat and who isn't.
Mm, mm, mm.
Mhm.
We're gonna try to make sense of this, but I don't know if we can. Right? Because again, I mean, and part of this conversation, just going back to kind of the audience, is we want you to see that correlation as I referenced. We want you to see that, you know, this the conversation around breed restrictions is not a new one, actually.
Mhm.
It's one that we've been having for generations, for centuries, and we're trying to kind of create some understanding for you as to where it all began, right? I mean, granted, we're starting with slavery again, began, you know, probably before that, right?
Mhm.
Um, but at least we can pinpoint an era where it's being demonstrated in a variety of different ways, so that you can better understand why the elimination of breed restrictions is so important. Right.
Absolutely.
Now, we do want to end on a positive note.
Mhm.
So let's take this conversation. So we've kind of talked about the reference to, you know, Negro dogs, N-word dogs. and the purpose that they serve, right? In
Hmm.
slave trade and utilized by slave catchers and slave patrol. Then we moved the conversation from recognizing it was a societal thing to becoming more of a political thing, right? Through
Hmm.
legislation, through laws, not only like you said in South Carolina, but we got Maryland, Virginia, like all over y'all. So it's not just specific to, again, one city or state. I said that
Hmm.
earlier in our conversation, but across the US. So, let's talk about the fact that, again, these attempts to maintain white domination versus black subordination was not something that we created, meaning the black
Right.
community didn't come in here and say, hey, let's use dogs because you got to keep us down, right?
Right.
Like, we ain't really saying that.
Right.
Um, but I want to talk about, like, the relationship that did exist between black people and between dogs of various breeds, right? Not
Hmm.
just bloodhounds to the extent that again they became weaponized, but talk about was there a positive relationship between black people and dogs? Did that even exist?
Absolutely. And I love this question, because everybody has a story about how their grandmama was afraid of dogs and would never let them have one. Um,
My grandmama.
right. And there's reason for that, but there's also a lot of love between black folks and dogs that is just as historic. I have read about enslaved people who used dogs to help them escape slavery, and that
Mhm,
dogs were good at hunting, securing sustenance for the
mhm,
journey. Even those who didn't escape, dogs still could feed them and their families more than what they were allotted by the people who were enslaving them. Having a dog who enabled you to hunt could also put some money in your pocket if you're able to sell these things, more money than you're getting as an enslaved person or even as a free black person at the time. Um, so there's always been this collaborative aspect between black folks and dogs as well that I think is less discussed because it isn't traumatic and black trauma really sells. Um, but it's important to acknowledge that side because there's a through line for love between black folks and dogs just as much as there's a through line for fear.
So, and so to me, that's so interesting. And I know I'm about to ask a question that I already know the answer to, but just for the sake of exploring, right? Exploring, so again, so we have, like, to your point, two stories, right? We
Mm-hmm.
have this story around, the violence, the fear that Black people have as it relates to dog. But then you talk about a very positive one, right? I mean, the one that, we would assume most dog lovers or pet lovers have with
Mm-hmm.
their pets, and it's loving and it's caring. You know, again, I probably know the answer to this, but why one story over the other, right? Like the dominating conversation is around this perception of fear and violence, and that's just the way our relationship stands. Um, why?
Well, we can talk about that forever. I have a lot of thoughts. I have a lot of thoughts on the reasons that the negative things about our lives tend to stick way more
Mm,
than the positive
mm,
aspects. But I feel like that is also historic when people talked about the range of emotions that Black people could feel, enslaved Black people could feel, is usually limited to these really negative experiences. And then you start covering our fights for rights, our resilience, our oppression, essentially, in the 20th century with the civil rights movement, and that's a whole industry in and of itself. Just the coverage of that, looking at everything we have to fight, and then you get to today where Black death is viral,
mm, mm,
Black
mhm,
trauma is viral, um, and in real life and in media and fiction, people really like to see us struggle for
mhm.
some reason. So it's no surprise to me that the negative through line stuck more than the positive one.
So we got to make the positive stick, right? We got to
Absolutely.
bring that forward, right? And
Hmm.
so, with that being said, and again, we're not here for all the doom and gloom, y'all. It might sound
Right. We
like,
giggly as heck. Look at us.
yeah, look, if you guys go to Cassidy's Instagram, it's all about the happy with Ginger,
It
right? Like,
is.
it's all about the happy with Ginger.
Exactly.
It's all about the fun, right? And so let's talk about the positive. So we're preparing for, series 2, series 3, and just let me reiterate, audience, the second part of our session, excuse me, I said that wrong, session 2 and 3, a part
Mm-hmm.
of our series, we're going to focus on the civil rights movement, right, and
Mm-hmm.
how dogs and that relationship with the Black community existed at that point, and then take it for a third session into present day. So I'm going to ask my guest speaker, the great Kassidi here, how what is the positive theme that we want our audience to keep in mind as we continue our conversation through these eras?
Just we have loved. That's that's the through line for me. We have always loved, um, even just beyond animals, but we've loved our pets as well. I think there is a negative stereotype that characterizes Black folks as neglectful
Mm-hmm.
or cruel toward animals. Um, but that's because nobody's looking at all of the Black people who are not doing those things,
Exactly.
who are loving their pets, taking care of them, keeping them for decades. My
Mm-hmm.
neighbor's dog is 12. I love her so much. I'm convinced she's going to live forever. But those are the stories that don't get highlighted as much.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
we're going to highlight them.
We're changing the narrative,
We're going to change this narrative.
right? So, I mean,
We're,
so hopefully, audience, you have a better understanding. We're starting off at a very foundational point. And so we hope that through this discussion, not only are you being educated, like I said, around how it all began, right? But then also we want to keep you to keep in mind that we are trying to change the narrative. And so how can you assist with that? Because we firmly believe the concept of breed restrictions is on this negative, is on this negative perception of the relationship that exists between Black people and dogs. And we know that's not right. We know that's not correct. And so we want to make sure that the correct, the positive stands forward and becomes more prominent so that the need or the thought that there is a need around breed restrictions doesn't exist anymore. So
agree.
look, y'all better come back.
Come on back. Come on
You
down.
think they're gonna come back? They're gonna come back.
You gotta come back. Look at
Yeah.
this. Look at this banter. We're delightful.
I don't know if I've ever been called delightful.
I think we're delightful.
We are delightful. We are delightful. I'm gonna own that. I'm gonna own that.
Yes.
I'm gonna hashtag that today. Delightful. So thank you so much, audience. Again, come back for session 2. We'll let you know when that is. It's coming soon, not too long, far away. But you have Kassidy's Instagram hashtag.
There we go.
I'm on LinkedIn. I'm streaming
Mhm.
live right now. Hopefully it worked. I don't know technology. We'll figure it out. But hopefully it worked. But find me on LinkedIn, Ngozi Nnaji, Akko Insurance Consulting. Cassidy is on LinkedIn as well. I found
Uh,
her. I
yeah,
found
I
her.
haven't updated that in a long time. So don't believe anything you read there. Unless you're hiring, then let's talk.
Look, Regina says she's going to make us T-shirts that says "delightful"
Ooh,
hashtag
yes.
delightful.
Thank you. Need
Look,
that.
Regina, if you can get that done before the next session, Cassidy and I will wear them on the next session. What do you
I'll
think?
wear it every day of my life.
We have to get one for Ginger. We have to get one
Oh
for Ginger.
yeah. Delightful as well. Yup.
So again, thank you guys. We appreciate you. Stay tuned for the next session.
All right.
Peace.
Always a pleasure.